I've got a fair bit to get through, so I shall race into my talk. And as you can see from the first slide, I think that gives you a bit of an idea of my view of making impact. Takes perseverance. But I'll be talking to you a bit more really about imagination, and I'll really be talking to you about your discipline and what you make of that discipline. Being asked to talk about making an impact has led me to a arguably depressing deliberation on what impact I've made. I've really only made a couple of clear impacts on government policy, but I have made quite a lot of, but there's a little bit of excitement around the edges. So the first two things where I've had some impact are up there in white. The next two are things where I've had some impact on the debate so far as to get into policy promises. Peter Costello quite likes my thoughts on the Future Fund, but I suggest that we just be able to, the Future Fund, have a retail option. Peter Costello, running the Future Fund, wants you to be compelled to invest in the Future Fund, which I don't kind of run that far. And then I have helped start debates on a range of things. And then there's the ones in little type are things where I would like to say I've started a debate. I've started a debate in my own mind and in public texts, but it hasn't really taken off. And I'm also in frequent discussion with various parties about their work, and that's all, of course, quite confidential, but it's fun. One of the most fundamental things that I want to say to you is that this is, I think, a model that most people have of their idea about their relationship between their work and their discipline. Their discipline is kind of 80% of it. I'm an economist, this expression that's taken off in the last 20 years, speaking with my ... hat on. I hate that sort of talk, as if you're programmed to think in a certain way and all economists think the same. Of course, Harry Truman had a very different attitude, and economists were thinking very differently in those days. When he said he wanted a one-armed economist because economists kept saying to him on the one hand this and on the other hand that. I think that it's much more like that. I think that it's much more about having some basic ideas. Some of the ideas in economics are very powerful and applied well can be very useful. But it's really all in looking around. Isn't that a cool little image? You'll see a bit of that. It's really all in looking around and working out how you're going to apply that idea. For instance, we hear that bureaucrats are, whenever I hear that bureaucrats and the system is risk averse, I think, no, it's not risk averse. There is a very specific way in which it's risk averse. It's process hugging risk averse. But our current economic policy is not risk averse. For instance, we are massively exposed to China. That's okay. We are making a decision to maximise growth at some cost to risk. But don't tell me we're risk averse. If we were risk averse, we would have dialed down the growth and had less exposure to China. So it's all about how you use ideas, and I'm a great believer in trying to really pay some attention to the way in which you do that. The other thing that that I think is useful to know to explain the way I'm trying to do things is to know that I was doing economics before I knew I was doing economics and before I studied any economics. That's an economist before he became an economist. That is my father as a 19-year-old asylum seeker sitting in the desert or near the desert on the Hay Plain in 1941. And that's him as he became an economist. It's up to you whether you think that's an improvement or not. And then something fairly, let's just be frank, something fairly unfortunate happened, which is that his two sons tried very hard not to be economists, and they both failed. All I can say is that one of them went on to marry an economist, and I'm not that one. So I am trying to break out, and we'll see. You can decide whether that's done me any good or not as I go on. But a way into that, so a way of illustrating what I mean by that is that this is Stockholm. I'm not putting it up there because I think I'll be there one day receiving a Nobel Prize, but because I was there, and I can't even be sure in my mind whether this was 1967 or 1977, but I saw my first, and I can someone might like to test this for me to tell me whether it's 67 or 77, because I saw my first disabled parking spot sign. Now, if it was 1967, this is a bit worrying because I was 11 years old and it suggests I was a fairly painful 11-year-old. But I remember looking at that and thinking that the sort of discussion I'd had about economics gave me a way of thinking about that. Was it a good idea to have this thing empty a lot of the time in order for someone who might really need it to have it? You can see how how the discipline of economics is introducing you to those ideas. And so I call this reading the economics of that parking space, and so let me try and do it for you. Firstly, money and that resource is the resource of the parking space is a means to an end. It's not the end itself. The end in the 1920s used to be called utility and has been reinvented as well-being. The next thing that economics does is that it asks what I call the Spice Girls question. And the Spice Girls question, we all know, all together now, tell me what you want, what you really, really want. And so we have to decide, do we really, of course it's a nice idea to have a parking space for people who are disabled, but do we really, really want it to be empty a lot of the time? So that's the question. And so economics will provide you with a way through that question. And it says, and essentially, to put it very simply, is it worth more? A very loaded term, the word more, worth a lot of unpacking as a free spot or for disabled parking. Now, economics has a concept that helps us go further into that, which is consumer surplus. And I'm just going to assume that I don't need to explain consumer surplus here. But as you can see, those people who are disabled are likely to be the people who are getting the most utility or well-being out of that parking space. Now, there's another trick, which is that money isn't utility. So we've got to if we want to ask the Spice Girls question, we've got to get rid of that idea of price, and we've got to ask the question about utility. And that makes it a lot harder. For two reasons. Economists should know a term from the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. That is, we can see prices, we can measure prices, and so it's very easy to think that prices are more real and more important than this underlying thing, which is really what the point of it is. And the second thing is that price and money gives us two things. It gives us a way of measuring and making concrete, and it gives us what I call policy purchase. It gives us a way to interact with the space in a way that gets us what we want. We can, I mean, this is a bit impractical, but for the purposes of the exercise, we could auction the parking space, but we can't auction utility. So that's a way of unpacking, and those ideas turned up in the to their great credit, in the productivity report, in the Productivity Commission's report, which set off the National Disability and Insurance System. Now, just by the way, I expect the NDIS will account for more than its fair share of disasters, and that isn't a reason for a moment for saying that it won't do vastly more good than harm. But unfortunately, its disasters will be the things that will, and in fact do, attract the attention of the crowd. So another thing I want to talk to you about is reform, this great word. And I want to distinguish between two types of reform, or two ways of thinking about reform. I won't go through all of that, but there's reform as a critique of what went before, and a lot of work in the 50s and 60s, particularly out of the University of Chicago, was very effective work in showing that things that people thought governments were doing, they either weren't doing or they weren't doing it very well. And that leaves the problem of policy purchase. It doesn't tell you what to do. I think the most important, if you like, the most impactful ideas are what I call policy hacks. And policy hacks open up the policy repertoire. What am I talking about? These are two Chicago economists, Milton Friedman's distinction between funding and delivery. So Milton Friedman separates out the idea that government might fund education and says, should it also fund delivery? Those are two questions. They're two categories. They're not honest. You can then choose to agree or disagree about any of those things, but they give you a way of thinking about things and a way to operationalise them. And that led to things like vouchers and the thing that we should all be proud of, which is that Australia led the world in introducing income contingent loans, and the student loan market in Australia is vastly more efficient than, for instance, in the United States. Ronald Coase's idea of thinking of policy problems in terms of the allocation of property rights, which led very directly to the idea of auctioning access to scarce resources, for instance, spectrum and emissions. Those things have been tremendously successful. It doesn't mean that they can't be screwed up politically or intellectually, but huge successes for government policy have come out of those things. And so I would say that these things are examples of ideas that are specific, that are robust, that are actionable. Are they ideological? I don't think they're ideological at all. And the pity of it is that, because you can go one way or the other on all of these things, but the pity of it is that we took a shortcut. And the shortcut we took, which was to say that we wanted that reform was being more market oriented, whatever the hell that means, has led to what we now have as a kind of paradigm war. And in fact, economics was through the reform era a little bit like politics, a kind of a culture war in which you sort of decided, if not exactly what you thought, your orientation to things before you saw what the thing was, which I think has been disastrously dumbing down and would be my more detailed way of answering some of the questions that some of the statements that Stephen was talking about people's confidence in economists. And if you're talking about confidence in economists, where better to go than Leonardo da Vinci? There he is trying to think about how to fly. And how would you fly? Well, you'd put wings on, wouldn't you? And you'd flap them. That's a good start. It's a terrible conclusion, as we now know. But that's where you start. And there he is. And what he's doing there is he's trying to take his idea from one domain, which is birds, into his own domain. Work needs to be done when you do that. Grabbing hold of a metaphor in one place, you can't just stick it somewhere else. You have to work with it and see if it works. That's his device for flapping. That wasn't going to cut it, as it turns out. And that's what market-oriented reform looks like to me. It's not properly thought through. It's appealing. I mean, looks good. But it's a mistake waiting to happen. So now I'm going to show you a video very quickly. Some of you may have seen it. It's a really cool video to watch. Then I'll talk to you briefly about the difference between economics and engineering, but you'll be able to see something about the difference right there. That's a pretty good looking bridge. Almost everything about that bridge is fine.
Tacoma Bridge, Washington, opened only a few months ago, was built at a cost of over $6 million. But misfortune overtakes the great structure. These are some of the most amazing pictures ever recorded by a newsreel. The actual collapse of the world's third largest suspension bridge. Only a 35-mile-an-hour wind is blowing, but this apparently sets up a rhythmic swinging of the bridge, which increases with each swing. Finally, the swinging road and the suspension cables give way and plunge into the water below.
So it's remarkable, isn't it, that, well, if you're an engineer, you're taught that it doesn't matter how many things you get right about the bridge. One thing wrong about the bridge, even if it's a subtle thing, it's no bridge. It's really not a good look. And economics isn't like that. In economics, even the discipline itself, and that was in fact the burden of part of my argument with Krugman, is that it's people showing that they're clever, people showing that they can inhabit a paradigm and build something more, and literally not worry about whether it's going to be useful or where the loose ends are as they're doing it, and therefore waste a lot of time. And worse than that. So I'm going to give you some examples. So economics is very prone to fads, and so is policy, and it's exacerbated by a cult of announceables. Now, this is a really hard problem, and most of it is about our political culture, not about economic advice. But the fact is that we are now in a situation perfectly described, certain aspects of our policy were perfectly described by Lord Atkin at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, when he described rowing as the perfect preparation for public life because it enables you to face in one direction while you go in the other. Regulation, which Mark will be speaking to you about later on. We have gone through for over 30 years, 33 years if you date it to 1986 when Bob Hawke announced minimum effective regulation, a top-down approach which palpably doesn't work, but we keep doing because it sort of sounds like it works. We go through the motions. This is evidence-based policy. A New South Wales Audit Office said, these are marvellous quotes, the program evaluation initiative is largely ineffective. No information is provided on the performance of programs that have been evaluated. But there you are, there was an announcement and so on. This is an excellent report by the Institute for Government about all the ways in which government in the UK, the announcement of a 12-year industrial strategy every 3 or 4 years tells you all about it. And economics, there's a way, this is a real problem in economics and in economic policy advice. Most of you have probably heard the joke, assume a can opener, and we are assuming markets, we're assuming that markets are self-establishing and sustaining. Now you can have a kind of theological argument about whether the market evolved spontaneously or not, but the sorts of things we're talking about are the NDIS and lots of other things. And those markets need a lot of attention if they're going to work well. And we should not start from the presumption that a market is a good thing. That is one possible way to do it. let me give you an example of this, which struck me recently. Look, there's lots of talk about how we should improve financial literacy in regard to people's choice of super and stuff like that. What we did is we decided we would set up a market, and then whenever something wasn't very good about the market, we said, well, choice must be the answer. And it's obvious, I don't think you can read those slides, but it's obvious in the numbers that this is not going to work, that we will have at least 40%, but my guess is over 80% of people who do not want to be an active part of this market. I don't want to be an active part of the market. I don't want to do due diligence on financial products any more than I do due diligence on medicos. I need a service which is an informed purchaser on my behalf. And in fact, we have one of those staring us in the face, because that is precisely what we do with Medicare, and these are the arguments for my particular suggestion that we have competitive neutrality where we have solved a problem for you fine folk, which is the Commonwealth superannuation system. We should make a quick hack and say that anyone can invest in a product like that, and we would actually solve a problem. And we can then return to that. We can then return to that question of markets as a part of the problem, as a part of our consideration, and we can say, yes, we want the future fund to be part of the market, and we want to make sure there's a system in which people like my mother-in-law, who barely speaks English, can say, well, look, I need a safe place to put my saving, and the government gives me this thing to invest for the next 40 years, and that's better than me taking the advice of someone who gets their foot in the door. Here's something that only occurred to me after I'd been doing a lot of, I've been in the sector of social innovation and innovating in social policy for about 10 years, and that is that there is a giant hoax going on. Here's the hoax. There's a sort of a general idea most people in this room would have that if you come up with an innovative social policy which lowers recidivism rates from people coming out of jail, or improves relations between troubled families, troubled parents and their children, and will do a lot of good, that we have a mechanism for absorbing that sort of thing into our practice of social policy. Now, in some kind of way we do, but it's much more through politicians than the bureaucracy. Because what will happen if you try and do this through the bureaucracy? Well, the first thing you'll be told is you need to get an independent evaluation. You'll get an independent evaluation done, and you'll go and get Deloitte, or, shout out here for lateral economics. And then the evaluation will be presented to, this NGO's wandering around wondering who to present it to, and there is no one to present it to, but you present it to some funders, and then they take it to Treasury or Finance, and they look at it and they say, yeah, well, it says it's independent. It's not independent. You commissioned it. We don't believe it, and nor should they believe it, because obviously we all know that independent evaluations concocted in that way can make all sorts of claims. So we actually have this major catch-22. So if we were to start the process of just engineering a mechanism whereby what we talk about as something that should happen, if we wanted to build the minimum of that, we would firstly want a clear understanding, a document, a standard document from Treasury and Finance of what that evaluation ought to look like when you get it done. There is no such document to my knowledge. Removal of conflicts of interest in commissioning those evaluations. The most obvious way would, well, with some central government involvement, some level playing field between new initiatives and status quo, and we don't have that. So we have lots of independent evaluations of these little things, and in the meantime, we're doing all the things we're doing, and those things are not subjected to comparison with the new things. And we have no mechanism for thinking about moving resources from one to another and so on. And none of this is really that much worth doing if the people out there doing this innovating don't feel that it's going to actually have an impact. It isn't just a nice set of things and a nice set of procedures. So that's how far we need to go. And I wanted to introduce you to some further thinking that I've done because I think it's so important, and I'll begin it with a little story, which is that this is a state of Australia and the subject is child protection. And as is the way with these things, a new fad began, and the fad was from on high, wouldn't it be good if some of the kids we've taken off their parents for abuse and neglect were returned to their parents because that would lower costs? Now that sounds almost like a joke, but I mean, it's a good idea if you can make it work. And so you need a lot of skill in identifying the best prospects and then supporting them through that process. After about 5 years of misery and mayhem that we don't hear about because it doesn't get in the papers because who cares about these people, it was abandoned. The average success rate was 30%. Think of the suffering of the other 70%. And there was an office. And over that period of time, by experimenting and working hard and taking the policy seriously, they'd got their success rate to 85%. Nobody knew about this. The policy was disbanded. That office was scattered to the winds. And this was discovered by the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, which I was chairing at the time. And that's not, I mean, that's a somewhat extreme example, but I think it will ring true to a lot of people here. So so that got me thinking. And it also got me connecting up some of the things I learnt during the Button Plan, because when I saw the Toyota production system, I thought this was an amazing thing. And I expected economists to be all over it. But economists looked at it and said, yeah, that's a rightward shift of the supply curve. And I'll just take you through where that thinking led me. The real problem of innovation in government and innovation in social policy is that arrow that I've drawn there, which is that the learning in these kinds of systems, or if you think of the successes we've had, like HECS, they've been things where the learning can be done at the top and driven down through what I call from the arteries and driven down through the capillaries. But these kinds of systems need to honour the learning that's going on in the field, and we don't do it, and there are very profound social reasons why we don't do it, and these were explained by one of my close personal friends, Adam Smith. A number of my close personal friends are no longer with us. And this is a remarkable thing for the patron saint of capitalism to have said. The disposition to admire and almost worship the people at the top is an overwhelming thing in human nature. This is Peter Shergold giving it a bureaucratic spin, which is that it's all about, if you want the big rewards, you go for policy, you don't go for delivery. Can you see there is a really big problem here, and that's the same for Canada. And that is the seal, I suppose, what do you call it, the crest of the Royal Society, and if you can read the words, nullius in verba, this incredible idea of the early modern period of modern science. We accept nothing from Aristotle, another close personal friend, by the way, We accept nothing from Aristotle and all the people we've read. We ask nature to speak for itself. We interrogate nature. And so my idea is, firstly, that the practitioners often will lack strong evaluation skills. They need to be given those skills. They need expertise. They need collaboration. They also need independence. As Richard Feynman, the great scientist, said, the first rule of science is you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool because you've got skin in the game. You've got a theory. Then we need to try to apply the same kinds of expertise, collaboration and independence to business as usual, and then we're trying to think about level playing fields here, what's working, what's not. And then and these things need to be independent. Remember, you must not fool yourself or your political minister or the public. You can see the degrees of difficulty ramping up there, if we're going to get this right. And so ultimately, I would like to move that structure out of a department, and I would effectively separate what I call brain and brawn. Somewhat unfairly to brawn, perhaps, but maybe other people would feel differently. And then it's noticeable that we actually have two different ways of delivering public goods. One way of delivering public goods we deliver through competitive provision. That is, politicians go out and say, if you elect me, I'll be running Treasury, I'll be running the Department of Social Security, I'll implement robo-debt, I'll increase or not increase the dole or whatever, and people vote, and through competition we deliver public goods, all fine and dandy. And then we have a whole range of institutions which directly deliver public goods. When we're delivering integrity, the Auditor General, the Ombudsman, we don't put a minister in charge and get them to boss that person around. If we want information about the unemployment rate, we don't want the Treasurer's hands all over those numbers. Understanding policy and delivery choices, the PC, the Parliamentary Budget Office and so on are independent of government. And so the idea of an Evaluator General is to try to deliver that idea of these separately delivered services, brain and brawn, right down inside departments. And if that sounds grand, which it is, it's not worth much if it can't be done on small scale, which it can be done, and it can be done inside departments with this idea of structural separation between brain and brawn. And I spoke to you about seeing the Toyota production system in 1983 and being amazed by it. This is my final thought about this idea of brain and brawn, which is that there is a huge tendency for brain to be in charge of brawn. There you are, that's a bit of a map of the human body in a way. The brain's on top and the brawn's down below being told what to do. And if we do that, I can actually show you some economic statistics about how that works out. I want these things to operate alongside in an independent but collaborative relationship. And here's the numbers that I'm talking about. These are really spectacular. So down here on the bottom figure is Japanese automotive labour productivity. This is a system which devolved decision-making to the shop floor, arranged people in teams, skilled them up with 10 times, literally 10 times as much training, and taught them how to, and then told them their job was continually to optimise their productivity. They did something similar with suppliers who, when they got cost reductions, got to keep some of them. They had a knowledge commons so that any supplier to Toyota had to open got access to the Toyota factory and had to open their factory to all other suppliers. You can see productivity growth there, And in absolute terms, it's way ahead of the US, the US automotive industry, even at the end. But at the end, the assemblers got the idea, but of course couldn't help themselves but to snatch any productivity gain that a supplier managed to come up with, and as a result, they didn't get any productivity gain. So that's the difference between top-down evidence-based practice, which is what the US system was, and bottom-up evidence-based practice, or what I like to call accountability from self-accountability. And of course, just an expression like accountability from self-accountability shows you that it's not a simple idea, because if it was a simple idea, it wouldn't work. So that's what I think is most important about what I'm talking about. Some general ideas for noticing things. As you can see, my approach to this is about noticing things and pondering things. But 3 assertions. It is not, just forget this stuff about whether something's more market-oriented or less market-oriented. It's always going to be a mix. It's not private or public initiative. It's how they're put together that matters. It's not the things, it's the interface between those things. And it's not more or less money to existing systems. It's perfectly obvious that I'm not telling you that you must never talk about that. That's my point is that that's all we talk about. And what goes missing is all the stuff that we could be doing, whatever the funding is involved. And if you think about the Toyota example, where the real action is. How am I going for time? 2 minutes. Yeah, well, look, we'll just sort of charge through a whole lot of stuff. There's my close personal friend, of course. You know, look at that. Wasn't that going to be interesting? You've got no idea. But, you know, this is all, you can read send me an email, I'll send you a link to stuff that talks about all this kind of stuff. Just to illustrate those claims that I made to you, this idea, that one, which is that Google, Wikipedia, blogs, Facebook, Twitter, they're public goods. They're public goods privately provided. And that led me to this thought, that they're only public goods privately provided because the amount of good they can do is so vast compared with the cost of establishing them, that it's possible. Google could have set it, and Wikipedia could set themselves up behind paywalls. They knew that they could, in Google's case, they could make that the value they'd create as a public good was so much vaster than as a private good that it made them much more money to take a tiny cut of $1 trillion than to take 60 or 70% of $200 million. That they made that decision. So it follows that there must be a city of digital public goods that don't exist for the same reason that you can't build a major arterial road just from the advertising on the billboards on the side of the road. What do they look like? And he said, going through all those slides again, what it looks like is, think about 23andMe. 23andMe for, right now there's a special on, I found out, for $99 we'll do a partial genomic analysis from a sample of your saliva, and imagine if that was a public good. If it was now that's the sort of thing that can't be billed, that 23andMe can't make it available for free because they go broke, but this is a public good waiting to happen. And imagine a situation where Medicare bulk billed it, and then the data, which is secure and your privacy is protected and so on, but it is structured according to open access for researchers to do research on personalised medicine. It's connected to various bits of e-health diagnosis, pharmacovigilance, research, and so on. that could apply wherever there is a SaaS system, wherever software as a service is being sold. The government could hold an auction, pay the money, make the service free, and then ask the question, how do we make this data much more productive than it is in private hands, and so on. That takes us back to a literature from the 1920s, the marginal cost conspiracy. What is the marginal cost of an additional unit of 23andMe, or sorry, an additional unit of zero? Nothing. So that, in neoclassical economics, is the optimal price. So a bunch of things to think about there. I'll race through this. Frameworks is nonsense. That's just inane diagrams, and you ask, why is this thing here? And the answer is no answer. It makes no sense. It's really a list. Anyway, and I was going to talk to you about well-being and how we are watching in New Zealand the tragedy occurring of a Prime Minister who really wants to target well-being, and the Treasury in New Zealand, which was much more serious about well-being than our Treasury was, which had a list of 5 things which it then used as talking points in speeches and didn't do anything with, to the New Zealand Treasury, which has taken it very seriously, but there's a problem. And the problem is that it's lots of data. There's a dashboard. Who doesn't like a dashboard? The Minister certainly likes a dashboard. And the data is not causal data, which most data isn't. And so the Treasury, they can tell the Minister things like what the self-reported well-being of Maoris in Rotorua is, but not how to improve it. And that's the data we need, and that's the data we could be going out and getting and having a really transformative effect on a, in my opinion, excellent agenda that a politician is trying to run with, but is being let down because economists are taking the God's eye view rather than actually having a good look around and working out the way we need to apply our discipline. So I think there, with anxious eyes looking at me, I will stop there, and if there's time, I'm certainly happy to answer questions. Thank you.